Please enjoy Maria Zaino's talk about India's surveillance state.
Hello, thank you very much for being here on a Sunday morning. I'm so terrible, I'm so sorry for being late. I have no sense of time whatsoever, which is probably something I should work on. So my name is Maria. I work at the Center for Internet Society in Bangalore, India. In particular, I'm working on the Privacy Project, and I'm specializing on surveillance in the country, and we're funded by Privacy International. So about a year ago, I moved to India to explore surveillance, but the first thing that we probably think of when we think of India is something like this, right? So one of the main problems in India is poverty, corruption, and so on. So when we first think of India, we think of images like this, or slums. So many argue, hey, surveillance is not even an issue in India. Surveillance is a Western elitist issue. How dare you claim that that's an issue here in India? What's surveillance? Most people don't even have access to the internet. What the hell are you talking about? Well, that's actually a good point. Until I went walking around in slums and noticed this. Hey, there are satellites in slums. Sure, they may not have access to clean water, but they do have a satellite and they do have cable TV. And that's to say the least, because they also have cell phones, as you can see. So although, yeah, sure, poverty and corruption and diseases and so on are major issues in India, at the same time, most people in India do have cell phones, and in particular, according to We Are Social, they have this pretty cool graph here, well, this data here, which shows that roughly 78% of the population in India use mobile phones. So that's pretty much the majority of the population who have mobile phones. And this is an important bit of information because most surveillance in India is carried out through mobile networks. So when trying to understand surveillance in the country, we need to first look at the laws. We need to understand which laws allow for surveillance, then which schemes and projects are being carried out based on these laws in order to implement surveillance. And then, of course, we have to look at the surveillance industry. Basically, who is providing the technology to aid law enforcement agencies so they can spy on us in India to begin with. So in India, there are 5 laws which mandate targeted surveillance. Namely, the Indian Telegraph Act, the Indian Wireless Telegraphy Act, the Indian Post Office Act, Section 91 of the Code of Criminal Procedure, and the very controversial Information Technology Act. Now, I'm not going to focus on the previous 4, a bit later on maybe, but I'm mainly going to focus on the Information Technology Act. And the reason for this is because it's a bizarre law. It makes no sense. It's absolutely crazy. Orwellian doesn't even start to describe it. So first of all, I'm going to draw your attention to Section 44 of this law. Basically what it says is that anyone who fails to provide request information to authorities will be punished. Oh my God, what the hell is this about? It's like we're in 1984 or something, right? Then there's Section 66A. Now this has drawn a lot of media attention because there actually have been lots of cases where people have been arrested and prosecuted as a result of this law. In particular, the section states that anybody who sends an offensive message, whatever the hell that means, through any type of communication service, whether that's a cell phone or the internet, will be punished. And the reason why I've used this image here is to draw your attention to one particular case, which occurred last November in 2012, where a politician, Bal Thackeray, died, and as a result of that, they shut down Mumbai. And so one woman in Mumbai posted on Facebook something like, oh my God, I can't believe they shut down Mumbai just because this politician died. And then the other girl next to her liked the post. Because they dared to do so, they were arrested. They were literally arrested because they posted, I can't believe Mumbai shut down because of this politician's death, and because the girl liked it. So this just shows, at a very small extent, what kind of abuse and power the government is capable of as a result of this law. Then there's the famous Section 69 of this law, and of course it's famous for completely the wrong reasons. This section allows for the interception of any information transmitted through a computer resource, meaning that literally anything you do online or through your computer anyhow, especially if your computer is targeted remotely, can be essentially intercepted. And once it's intercepted, law enforcement agencies can gain access to that data and judge you based on that. And this section goes beyond that. It requires users to disclose their private encryption keys or fail jail sentences of up to 7 years. Now, this is bizarre to say the least, because the only hope we really have to keep our private data private is to use encryption, right? And so when the government, through this law, requires you to disclose your private encryption key, then that is extremely problematic to say the least. And not only does it say that, but this law generally states that if the government, for whatever reason, is intercepting your communications and hell, you're using encryption, they can call you up and say, hey, why are you using crypto? Decrypt this for me now. And if you don't, you're sent to prison. That's up to you to judge and decide how fair that is. Then there's Section 80, which basically allows the police to seize suspects in public places without a warrant. Now, we're talking about India, the world's largest democracy, population speaking. When we can see that in 2013, the world's largest democracy has sections as these ones, which allow people to be arrested in public with no real grounds, without a warrant, then that is fundamentally problematic for all democracies in the world, I think. Then, under this law, the Information Technology Act, there are the notorious cyber cafe rules. Now, the reason why the government went the extra mile in actually implementing these rules is because, hey, most people in India don't have computers. Most people in India use the internet through cyber cafes. So, what the fuck, what are you going to do? You have to, obviously, monitor cyber cafes. And to do that, they've implemented these rules, which basically require cyber cafes to maintain backup logs for each login by each user, and to retain such records for a year, and not only to do that, but also to ensure that such logs are not tampered with. And then, upon request, they can give that to the government. So literally, if you've used the internet or in any cybercafe in India, be very, very careful what you do, because be sure that the government will access that sooner or later. So these laws mainly, mandate targeted surveillance. So mass surveillance in India kind of falls in a gray area because it's not technically legally mandated, but it's not prohibited either. However, there are the license agreements which do. So the thing is that ISPs and TSPs in India and in most countries in the world, in order for them to operate, they have to comply with some license agreements, right? And if they don't, well, they just can't operate. So in India, the ISP license agreement basically requires all ISP providers to conduct blanket mass surveillance on their communications. And if they don't, well, they just can't operate. So essentially what they have to do is that they have to purchase the hardware and the software required to monitor the communications at their own cost in order to do this. Now, anyone can argue, what kind of incentive do they even have to purchase this hardware and software to begin with? It's not like they have a revenue per se from doing it. Well, like I said, they just can't operate if they don't. So they have to. And the craziest part about this license agreement, I think, is that bulk encryption is prohibited. And in general, if you use encryption that exceeds a 40-bit key length in symmetric key algorithms, then again, you have a problem. The only cases where you can actually do this, where you can actually use crypto more than 40 bits, is if you get specific permission by the ISP, written permission, right? And still, I'm guessing that in order to get this permission, they're going to be like, oh, why do you need it for? Who are you communicating with? How exactly are you going to use this for? So again, that kind of beats the purpose of using encryption to begin with, right? So technically, India does everything it can to prohibit encryption and to make sure that your data is all out there and vulnerable. And now this ISP license agreement kind of falls under this umbrella of the UAS license agreement, the Unified Access Services License Agreement. This applies to both ISPs and TSPs in India, and so now they're pretty much all required to conduct blackened surveillance under it. In particular, there's a section under this license agreement which mandates the implementation of the central monitoring system, which I'll refer to later on. And this is scary to say the least. So like I said, surveillance in India, mass surveillance, although it's not legally mandated, it is required through these fucking license agreements. So they still have to do it anyway. And then, of course, there are the mutual legal assistance treaties. Now, the MLATs are basically agreements between countries so that they can share intelligence data. India has such MLATs with another 35 countries, including the US, as you can see. Oh, how happy Singh is with Obama, right? Now, that's with regard to the legal aspects. So now let's look at the schemes been implemented based on these laws so they can actually carry out surveillance in practice. So first we have some data sharing projects, and it's kind of unfortunate that I have to say that data sharing projects aren't so bad as surveillance schemes because they're actually bad as well, but imagine how bad the situation is that I have to call these not so bad. So first of all, there's the National Intelligence Grid, which is basically an intelligence grid which links the databases of all departments and ministries of the government in order to create comprehensive patterns of intelligence. So what that means basically is that every single ministry in the government has a whole bunch of data that it collects. These are all linked together. So when the government wants to access like specific data about a specific person, instead of going to, I don't know, 10 different ministries and collecting one by one, they have this central database where it's all stored and collected. They've used the data mining software to analyze it and to profile that individual, and that way they have a clear idea of who that person is and how exactly they want to target that person or not. Then there's the CCTNS, which is quite similar. Essentially what this does is that it links the databases of 14,000 police departments across the country, again, to create comprehensive patterns of intelligence. And what does that mean? That means that, hey, they want to tell a story about you. It doesn't matter if that story is right or wrong. It doesn't matter if it's true or not. They're going to tell a story about you, and based on that story, they're going to probably arrest you or not, and maybe even worse, who knows. The worst part is that all of this lacks legal backing. Now, on top of that, we have other schemes like the Lawful Intercept and Monitoring Program. Now we're proceeding to the surveillance schemes. This one basically operates on two levels, for telecommunications and internet communications. With regards to telecommunications, essentially all mobile operators in India are required to install their own lawful intercept and monitoring system at their premises and to intercept all communications. With regards to internet communications, well, the government has installed this type of system at the international gateways of all ISPs, and that way all internet traffic is centrally intercepted by the government. And because, of course, that's not enough, they also have the internet monitoring systems. So we know as a fact that internet monitoring systems are used in two states, in Delhi and Assam. By the way, Assam is a state up in the northeast. It's a very politically sensitive area. It's really creepy that they're using it, using this there in particular. There are many allegations that this system is also used in other states, like in Maharashtra and Karnataka. However, we don't have proof of that. And the reason why we don't have proof of that is because we only have tenders for these two states, for Delhi and Assam. And the reason why we don't have tenders for the rest of the states is because, well, most surveillance in India is carried out in fucking secret. So in most cases, they don't even care about legalism, what they do, so we don't even know what's going on. But what we do know for this is very limited, and that's that basically sniffers are used to be able to, detect keywords and intercept communications. And then even worse than all the previous, because obviously the rest wasn't enough, there's also the centralized monitoring system. Now, the centralized monitoring system has been carried out since 2009. That's 4 years. Do you know when we really started to know about it? When there was actually any media coverage about it? This April, this year, so 4 years later. This damn scheme has been carried out for 4 years in secret, and only now we know about it. So essentially what it does is that it intercepts all telecommunications in the country. Everything. This is basically a project carried out by the Center for Communication Security Research and Monitoring, and is implemented by the Department of Telematics, which is a department of the Ministry of Telecommunications, go figure. And since its implementation, we know that $72 million have been allocated to this project. And that is as of June 2013, as of 6 months ago, and this is based on what the government says. So this may not actually be the right figure. It was probably more than this, as we can imagine. Now, this itself is extremely problematic because we're talking about India. We're talking about a country which has huge problems of poverty, and instead of investing this money in education and health and so on, they're investing it in intercepting telecommunications. The question is why? Is it about control? Who knows? They're very secretive about it. So how does the CMS even work? Well, I mentioned the Lawful Intercept and Monitoring System before. So based on that, all TSPs in India had to install lawful interception systems in their premises. Now, what they're doing with the central monitoring system is that they are integrating lawful interception systems with ISF servers. ISF servers are intercept, store, and forward servers. So now that they've integrated these two systems, the lawful intercept systems and the ISF servers, these then basically transfer data to the regional monitoring centers. So every state in India has a regional monitoring center. And then all these regional monitoring centers are linked to the central monitoring system. So the main place where data is stored, and that's in Delhi. And this data basically, from the TSP, it goes directly to the regional monitoring center, and then from there it goes directly to the central monitoring system, and this is all carried out, through dark fiber optic cables, the way it's transmitted at least. So what has already been done with regards to central monitoring system? So we have a few governmental documents which verified these facts, one of which is that as of 6 months ago, 80% of the physical data center had already been built. So it might even be ready right now. So it's safe to assume that this project is way ahead. In general, it's been carried out in 3 phases, each one lasting around 13 to 14 months. So it's probably safe to assume that right now, most of it has been carried out. And we know that for a fact, especially because most of these services have been fully integrated and tested for 2 of the largest TSP providers in India, and that is MTNL and Tata Communications. So most people in India use MTNL and Tata Communications, in some cases, even me, unfortunately. And we know as a fact that if you're using these 2 TSP providers, all data is centrally intercepted and stored in the central monitoring system. What we also know is that about $8 million have been given to BSNL, which is another large TSP provider in India, for interconnecting 81 central monitoring system locations. And what we also know in addition to that is that the government has signed a memorandum of understanding with BSNL so that they can use a multi-label, multi-protocol switch, what's it called? MPLS connectivity in addition to this. So when I was looking through governmental documents, what is very interesting is that the government actually made an attempt to say, no, CMS is not a problem. Hell, CMS is good for your privacy. And so what they were arguing in their documents was like, oh, damn, over the last months, we've received so much criticism from the media and from organizations that we're infringing on people's privacy and human rights. Well, we've got to do something about that. So they actually came down with a list of why the CMS is privacy friendly. And I think the reasons are a bit hilarious, but that's up to you to decide, I guess. So the first reason is that, hey, the CMS will just automate the existing process of interception and monitoring. No worries. I mean, we were intercepting your communications anyway. We're just automating it now. So what's the big deal? We're protecting your privacy. Yay. The second one is that the deception and monitoring will be in accordance with Section 5, Paragraph 2 of the Indian Telegraph Act. Do you know what this section says, basically? It says that the deception of communications can be carried out in the occurrence of a public emergency or for public safety when it is necessary or expedient to do so. Okay, then. So basically, we have these very broad terms of public emergency, public safety. If it's necessary or expedient to do so, intercept communications. And therefore, of course, this is privacy friendly. Then there are other arguments that, hey, we will bypass TSPs. We no longer need to, ask TSPs to give us the data. Because what will happen now, essentially, is that, as I mentioned before on how it works, is that all data from TSPs will go directly into the CMS database, which means that they don't have to ask them for it. So they're like, okay, so TSP providers, they won't access your data, only we are accessing your data. Therefore, your data is safe with us. Sure. The next point is that the CMS authority, and by the way, by CMS authority, what we really mean is the Intelligence Bureau, they will provision the deception requests from law enforcement agencies. So what that means is that law enforcement agencies will be like, hey, CMS, I want access to this person's data, and they will give it to them. And they're arguing that the CMS authority won't have access to the content data. I'm not sure how that's actually even possible. Like, how can they give the data if they don't even access it? I don't know, that's a mystery, which they should, I don't know, enlighten us about. And the last point is that the CMS will include a non-erasable command log for all provision activities. And the reason why that's privacy friendly is because that way you can check to see what type of data has been provisioned to law enforcement agencies in every given time, and that way it can be transparent and so on. However, they don't mention like who is going to maintain this fucking command log, who is going to have access to it, who can control it, and who can check it to ensure that the right type of data or whatever, or under the right legal procedure, the data has actually been handed over to law enforcement agencies. There is no checks and balances whatsoever. So, of course, the CMS is good for our privacy, supposedly. I don't know. I'm just presenting the other side, their side. It's up to you to decide how privacy friendly this is or isn't. So, does anyone have an idea why I have some cell phones in front of the Taj Mahal? Okay, so this is BlackBerry. So the reason why I had this is because a few months ago, the Indian government signed this agreement with BlackBerry, essentially for the interception of solutions. So the agreement was so that all BlackBerry Messenger and all BlackBerry internet services can be intercepted. However, it remains unclear, if this falls under the central monitoring system or the lawful interceptor monitoring system. Hell, there's so many systems. It's not even clear what this has been carried out under, and they obviously, aren't open about it, so it remains a mystery. But we do know that BlackBerry has definitely been intercepted a whole lot in the country. Now, the UID. The reason why I'm including this random biometric thing here, this woman scamming her fingers, is because this is probably integral to everything else that I mentioned. So the UID scheme is the largest biometric data collection scheme in the world right now. Essentially what it does is that it requires Indians to give up their iris and their fingerprints. So to give up their biometric and also some other demographic data. Now in theory, this is voluntary. You can choose to use it. However, it's not that voluntary because there's this other program called the NPR, and under that, you have to register with the NPR, and then the NPR requires you to have a UID, so you have to register with a UID, but hey, it's voluntary. And then on top of that, in order to have access to almost all, if not all, governmental services in the country, you have to have a UID. So for example, if you're an Indian and you want to get access, and you belong in the below poverty line, and you want to get access to food programs or cash transfer programs, you have to have a UID number. You have to be registered with us. So also, if you want to enroll your kids to school, your kids can't go to school in many cases unless they're registered with a UID. And this goes on and on and on. So there are loads of government services which you just can't access unless you have this 12-digit number called Aadhaar, and unless you are registered with this scheme. So although it's voluntary, it's actually pretty mandatory, I think. And the reason why this is really, really concerning is because the UID pretty much serves as a unique identifier. So all other surveillance pretty makes sense in light of this. In which sense? The government has to intercept the communications of 1.2 billion people. Now, when it's doing that, it's likely that there'll be error in matching patterns, in creating profiles, and so on. So how do you make sure that this data that you have access to actually belongs to the person you think it does? Well, that's where the UID comes in. The UID verifies that, supposedly verifies that X data belongs to an X person. So, for example, if they have your data, which they've collected through the interception of your telecommunications or your internet communications, they link that to this number, and that way they know that, hey, it's you. It's your data, and I'm prosecuting you for sure. But then that itself is very problematic because, the larger the sample of data you have, the larger the probability for error. There have been loads of cases of corruption which have been reported. Many of the contractors of the UID have links with intelligence agencies, and in particular with US intelligence agencies. There have been many cases where data has just been lost, it's just disappeared mysteriously. That kind of shit happens in India all the time, I guess. So this itself is a very vulnerable system, so it's very questionable, with regards to how effective it is and everything. And at the end of the day, fingerprints really, it's so easy to fake your fingerprints, right? If you just go into Google and you say, how to fake my fingerprints, they have 6 steps of how to do it. So using the system to verify people and to judge them and to arrest them and so on based on that is fundamentally flawed, in my opinion. Now, this here is the actual scanner that is used for the system. This is a fingerprint scanner. They use this to collect Indians' fingerprints. And anyway, so this small scanner, this small box, basically is really important because all other surveillance that I mentioned in India only really makes sense if this damn thing exists. So feel free to come later on and check it out and maybe play with it if you feel like doing so. So here, there's a honeypot. The reason why I have it is because all these schemes, especially the UID, the CMS, they basically are like a type of honeypot because when you centralize data, essentially what you're doing is that you're creating a centralized point for cyber attacks. So although they argue that, hey, all these systems are to increase your security, what they're actually doing is providing fake security because based on this whole honeypot premise that the more centralized the data is, the more vulnerable it is, it doesn't make any fucking sense. So, oh, sorry. So that's with regards to the schemes and to the laws. Now, in order to understand all of this, we need to see like which companies are actually providing the technology to be able to make these schemes even possible. So I started investigating the surveillance industry in India a few months ago. Initially, I had a random sample of 76 companies, then I narrowed it down to 50 companies. So I repeat, this is a random sample of surveillance technology companies. And what I did essentially was that I looked at their technologies, at what they do and everything, whether they comply with lawful regulations and so on. And so I ranked the companies. So here you have the list of the 50 companies. And here they're ranked from most harmful to least harmful. So the least harmful company is Legend Systems, and by the way, this is bought by Legend Systems. So if you think that a device which can make all surveillance possible is sold by the least harmful company, then you don't want to know what the most harmful ones do. Now, the criteria that I used to rank these companies were basically two. First of all, the types of solutions they produce and they sell, and who they sell them to. So solutions and clients. The reason why I looked at the solutions, I ranked them based on another two subcategories, outreach and harm. So basically, if the solutions do mass surveillance or targeted surveillance, and how harmful they are in the sense like how much data do they actually capture. For example, it might be more harmful, like a phone monitoring solution is potentially more harmful than biometrics because a phone monitoring solution can potentially conduct mass surveillance. It captures much more data than a biometric device, and it goes more harmful. And then with regards to the clients, I had 4 categories of clients, so ISPs, TSPs, law enforcement agencies, and so on, corporations, organizations, and the public. And I ranked ISPs and TSPs as the most harmful category, and the public as the least harmful. ISPs and TSPs as the most harmful because they have direct access to all the data. So from this, essentially, I've put some interesting points, or not so interesting. That's up to you to decide. So out of this random sample of 50 surveillance technology companies, 18 of them sell phone monitoring solutions. And I repeat, it's a random sample. So if in a random sample, a big amount of these companies sell phone monitoring solutions, that itself is very problematic. And the reason why I'm focusing on phone monitoring solutions is because, like I mentioned, roughly 80% of the population in India have cell phones. So this directly affects them. Then, out of the 50 companies, 30 of them sell solutions to law enforcement agencies. And I repeat, this is a random sample, so that itself is very problematic. And what's very interesting is that out of the 50 companies, only 6 of them comply with lawful interception standards and regulations. When I refer to lawful standards and regulations, I'm referring to ETSI, CALAIR, and these very interesting regulations. So out of these companies, actually, 3 of them are not even Indian, right? 3 of them, so Ascom, Verint, and Utimaco, they're not Indian. The other 3 are. So out of my sample of 50 companies, 40 of them were Indian, 10 of them were from other countries in the world. And it's very interesting to see that out of my 40 Indian companies, only 3 of them bother to comply with lawful interception standards. This itself is very problematic because, you know, if you're doing surveillance, you might as well put a front, if you're smart enough, right? You might as well put a front and say, hey, at least I comply with lawful regulations. You can't judge my technologies or anything. But only 3 of them have bothered, which is quite sad, actually. Then again, out of these companies, only 19 of them are certified, and only 7 of them are ISO 27001 certified. Now, the reason why I'm focusing on the ISO 27001 certification is because this certification is with regards to data protection. And so all these companies are handling sensitive personal data. And so they have to comply with some type of standard or certification with regards to data protection. Now, only 7 of them are ISO 27001 certified, which means that it's likely that most of them aren't. And while they are using your personal data or Indians' personal data, they don't even care about putting a front to show that they even care about it or that they're making an effort to protect that data for whatsoever. Then only 19 of these companies have privacy policies, which isn't a surprise. It just goes to show that, you know, countries are going ahead with selling these crazy solutions and they're not even bothered to pretend that they care about your data. What's interesting, though, is that when I was going through these companies, what I noticed is that the more controversial or the more scary the product of a company is, the more likely it is to comply with lawful regulations and to be certified, which is very ironic itself, you know, but it also kind of makes sense because I guess if you're selling, you know, very scary products, you want to put a front that, hey, I am certified, I care about the law, I care about your data. It's probably not true, but that's usually the case. With regards to the least harmful technology companies, like I mentioned before, Precision Biometric, Legend Systems is supposedly the least harmful, and that's where I got this biometric device from. It's very funny that Mobile Spy is ranked as the second least harmful company, and that's really tragic because essentially what it does is it sells mobile spyware. And like I said, most people in India use mobile phones, and so phone surveillance really affects them. Ravi Raj Technologies, although it only sells biometrics, itself is a bit worrisome because actually what they do is that they sell biometrics to governments like Tunisia and Zimbabwe and Saudi Arabia. So when you have a company selling biometrics to non-democratic regimes or to transitioning to democracy countries, you understand that that itself can be very problematic because they can use such biometrics to target political dissidents or anyone who doesn't agree with them. So with regards to the most harmful surveillance technology companies, my data. First of all, there's Comlabs. You might have heard of Comlabs before, because WikiLeaks actually have released a whole bunch of documents, brochures, with regards to their products. So they have a whole wide range of internet monitoring and phone monitoring solutions. I've only picked out two, which I thought were quite interesting, and you can look them up further. The first one is Verbanet, which is basically an internet interception solution. And then there's Verbacenter, which essentially, in a unified way, intercepts telecommunications. And the interesting thing about what it does is that it's even able to detect cognitive and emotional stress in voice calls and flag them. So the message from here is, beware of how you speak on the phone. Make sure you have no stress in your voice. Don't be stressful. They'll think you're a target and they'll come arrest you or something. Crazy. Second one that I point out, another very harmful company is Vehera. So these are all Indian companies, right? So Vehera sells a whole wide range of products, including V-Crimes. It's a CDR analysis system. Essentially, what it's able to do is gather intelligence and unveil hidden relationships and patterns and so on. And it's able to do this by using an advanced statistical tool. And it's even able to detect sleeper cells. And on top of that, it can even analyze more than 40 billion records in less than 3 seconds. Or at least according to their brochures. And I repeat, this is an Indian company. And the reason why I'm pointing this out is because there's been so much talk about FinFisher and Gamma Group, and yes, I completely agree, that's some scary shit out there. But what I'm trying to emphasize here is that a lot of equally harmful companies exist in India as well. In some cases, they're even more scary. Palladia Networks. Palladia Networks, they sell solutions for the interception of the internet, for the interception of telecommunications. They sell an SSL interception and decryption system, and cyber cafe monitoring systems. Because, like mentioned before, you have to monitor cyber cafes. Most people in India use cyber cafes. How else will you do that? What's very interesting about this company is that in their website, they openly state that this supplies their solutions to the Ministry of IT. And that's very interesting because most companies don't. They're very secretive about who they sell them to. So I kind of feel that the more open a company is about what they do, the more dodgy they are, in a way. Because they have the balls to say, yes, we supply this to the Ministry of IT, and we're telling you about that, and we're untouchable. That's some scary stuff, I think. And then ClearTrail. ClearTrail is another company you may have heard of. Again, some of their brochures are on WikiLeaks as well. So they have a whole wide range of products, including ComTrail and Xtrail, which are for monitoring IP and voice networks. The one is for mass monitoring, the other one's for targeted. Now, QuickTrail, I think, is particularly interesting because this essentially what it does is a tactical Wi-Fi monitoring. So what it does is that in real time, it's able to monitor Ethernet LANs in India, and it's even able to deploy spyware into a target's computer. So if you think in India that you're safe because you're using Wi-Fi or because you're using the internet through a cyber cafe or through a hotel or any other public place, think again. It's very likely that your communications might be intercepted if you're a target. Then there's M-Trail, which is a bit worrisome because what it does is off-the-air interception of GSM phone calls. And the reason why this is problematic is because, well, off-the-air interception in India is technically illegal, for starters. So in 2011, there were these allegations that the National Technical Research Organization was snooping on politicians through off-the-air interception. And following this, the Ministry of Home Affairs issued a directive to ban all off-the-air interception in India. So since then, the Department of Telecommunications has really been busting everyone who's trying to produce this and sell this. But yet they're going ahead with this. And actually, they're not only selling this stuff to India, they're even selling this a lot to the Middle East. So actually, ClearTrail Technologies and Palladium are two companies which are probably the main suppliers of surveillance technologies in the Middle East and in other Asian countries, which is very concerning because we're talking about authoritarian regimes, we're not talking about democracies. But hey, even if we talk about democracies, well, it depends on how you define democracy, but still, you can see that in India, even though it's the world's largest democracy, the surveillance is crazy. And the main reason why it's crazy is because there is no privacy law. There is no privacy legislation whatsoever. No data protection, nothing. Nothing whatsoever. So here's the story. So essentially in India, you have all these strict surveillance laws which require you to hand over your encryption key, which mandate that all your communications are intercepted. You have these massive schemes implementing this. You have these technologies and these companies selling spyware, and yet there is no privacy law. On top of that, prior to the implementation of all the schemes that I mentioned before, there was no parliamentary or public debate prior to the implementation. So essentially what this shows is that the government does whatever it wants. It doesn't care if you feel that its schemes are, violating human rights or whatever, because it knows what's good for you. It's going to protect you, and you just have to blindly trust the government. This itself is very concerning because when a government doesn't even try, to put a front or doesn't even try to gain some type of public consent, that is fundamentally problematic for the nature of the regime. Even in the most authoritarian regimes, you will see governments trying to gain some type of public consent from the public before going ahead with schemes and projects which are invasive to people's human rights. But in India, that's not even the case. They don't even care about getting public consent. So that itself is extremely problematic, to say the least. So in light of all of this in India, no privacy law, all of these surveillance schemes, the question comes down to, is privacy dead? Or did it even exist to begin with? Well, many could argue that, hey, privacy didn't even exist to begin with because this is India and they don't necessarily have the concept of privacy in their culture because privacy itself is a very individualistic type of human right, so it's something that's more Western in a way. But in the end of the day, I think that privacy is very important, that everybody all over the world should have this right, regardless of their culture or whatever, because privacy essentially protects you from abuse from those in power. And that is, privacy ensures your individual freedom and your autonomy as a human being, and that has nothing to do with culture. So regardless of your culture, regardless of everything else, everybody should have this right. And in India, they're doing everything they can to violate this. Which is why, with the Center for Internet Society that I work with, we have drafted a law, because, a privacy bill, because, hey, if the government doesn't want to create one, we'll create it for them, and hopefully they'll implement it someday. So if you like, you can get in touch with me and I can share the bill with you, and if you have any feedback, if there are any lawyers out there who would like to look at it and give us any feedback on how to improve it, that would be wonderful. And in general, if anyone would like to cooperate in dealing and tackling surveillance in India and restricting it, please contact me. That would be amazing, because if we don't, right now this is still the beginning and we have to do something about it now. And if we don't do something about it now, we'll regret it in the future, because it's only getting worse. And actually, we'll regret it if we're lucky. If we're not lucky, we won't regret it. And the reason why we won't regret it is because we won't even see it, we won't even acknowledge it as a problem. And that is the worst thing that can happen. If surveillance is socially integrated on a global level, that's the worst thing that can happen, because we won't even acknowledge it as a problem, and hell, we won't resist to it and we won't try to tackle it. And so essentially what we're talking about is the ultimate control of our lives. So if you don't want to be if you don't want to be totally controlled, we have to do something about it now. And I think it's very important to start with India. India, a country of 1.2 billion people with an expanding middle class, and the reason why I'm emphasizing expanding middle class is because a lot of people are going to have more access to the internet over the next years. It means that more people are going to be under surveillance. And hey, they won't even tackle the system because they'll want to maintain their new economic status. So it's unlikely that they'll tackle the government because of surveillance, right? So we're talking about a much scarier system in the future, one which is likely to affect every single one of us in the future. So it's not just about India. This is a global problem, and I really recommend that we work together and we try to find a solution for it now before it is too late. Thank you. Is there time for questions? Questions?
Yeah, I think there will be some.
Okay.
All right, thank you very much. Now we have some time left for Q&A. Are there any questions? Please go to the microphones over there and over there. And yeah.
Hi, that's a great talk. You didn't talk about how getting a cell phone is so complicated in India. You need to register and fill out millions of forms. Is this information that's collected in the process of getting a SIM card actually used by the CMS, or is this a completely different branch of government?
I think the information gathered, when you register for a SIM card is it's not clear if it's used by the CMS, because essentially what the CMS does is that it intercepts like all telecommunications through TSPs. So that doesn't include data, for the SIM card per se. However, you are right that actually getting a SIM card is quite a complicated process, and the reason why it's complicated is because they try to gather as much data as possible. So in India, in order to get a SIM card, you have to give them a copy of your ID or your passport, you have to give them proof of address, you have to give them a contract which proves that you actually live where you do, and so on. So there's a lot of bureaucracy involved in actually getting a SIM card. However, nonetheless, most people, go with the bureaucracy and they register anyway, and most people use cell phones. But that type of data, which is gathered through that, basically this is stored in ministries, and like mentioned before, the data from different ministries are shared, through NatGrid. So in many cases, the government does have access to this data, and it can be used for whatever reason, but it doesn't fall under the central monitoring system per se, because that basically involves the data through TSPs.
Okay, over there's some questions too.
Yeah, thank you for your great talk, and this is really scary. I can't even believe we're talking about the NSA all the time, and this not at all, although it obviously affects a lot more people. But yeah, Western media and all that. My question is, can you talk about the political motivation in the mass surveillance in India a little more? Because in America we know it's all about terrorism and stuff, and in India I don't know if terrorism is a problem or if it's about, I don't know, child porn like we had in Germany, or I don't know what the official motivation is, and maybe you can also talk about what you think the real motivation might be.
Thank you. Good question. So just like in the West, the motivation is crime and terrorism, right? Actually, terrorism is actually more of a problem in India than it is in the US or in most countries and states, because there actually are terrorist attacks from Pakistan in India. I mean, terrorism actually is a problem in India, unlike most Western countries. So what we can see is that since 2008, since the 2008 Mumbai attacks, surveillance has just rapidly increased. So since the Mumbai terrorist attacks, we've had the implementation of the central monitoring system, we've had the implementation of the UID, we've had the implementation of the lawful intercept and monitoring system. So all these projects and these schemes that I refer to have been implemented following the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks. So I think it's safe to say that the 2008 Mumbai terrorist attacks are equally a landmark as the 9/11 terrorist attacks in the US. So yeah, they definitely quote crime and terrorism as a reason for this. In other cases, like in the case of the UID, which is a biometric data collection scheme, what they obviously can't quote crime and terrorism there. So what they do say in that case is that the reason why they're collecting biometric data is so that they can provide unregistered people in India an identity. Because most people in India live in rural communities, right? And they're not even registered. Like, they're kind of like invisible citizens. We don't even know they exist in many cases. And this makes it very hard for them to have access to governmental services. So what the government is arguing is that, hey, in order for us to provide them access to governmental services and for us to know who actually exist in the fucking country were enrolling their biometric data. So that's what they say with regards to that. Then with regards to child pornography, that as well is something they keep citing. Pornography in general is like illegal in India, so they obviously want to censor that as much as possible. And in general, over the last year, they're really trying to increase cybersecurity in general. They've even come down with this national cybersecurity policy, which they implemented a few months ago. And essentially, this cybersecurity policy allows for a lot of surveillance as well, and that ISPs and TSPs install their own hardware and software to monitor communications and so on, and that they share intelligence and everything else that comes with that. So in public, they do argue that the main reason for this is security, is to tackle crime and terrorism, is to tackle child pornography, and in some cases pornography in general, to provide an identity to citizens, like in the case of the UID. But in my personal opinion, I really don't think a government would invest so much money in such risky projects, because at the end of the day, they're risky, because what you're doing is that you're collecting humongous volumes of data from literally 1 billion people, and you're hoping this will make sense. You're hoping that when you mine the data, you'll be able to find the right person. So I think they're not really smart about it. I think they're just like, from one sense, I think they're just like copying the West. They're like, oh, the West, carries out surveillance to, tackle crime and terrorism. Let's do the same. Let's just intercept everything, monitor everyone, and hope that somehow this data will be useful. We don't know why we're gathering the data to begin with, but and hopefully later on we'll figure out why. So at the end of the day, I think that partly they're just blindly copying the West, and on the other hand, I think it comes down to control. Because every government knows that if you're able to know everything about everyone, you're super powerful at the end of the day. Like, there's nothing more empowering than knowing everything a person has done, everything they're doing, and everything they're likely to do. Because even that is something you're able to predict. Because once you have all this data and you mine it, and you use behavioral statistics on it, you're able to predict with some type of probability how this individual is likely to behave in the future. And if you apply this on a mass level, you're probably likely to predict how the masses are likely to behave in the future. So this really comes down to public control. And I think that anyone who's in power, like, all they care about is guaranteeing and ensuring that they're still in power. So it really comes down to public control, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we have time left for one question, and we have some questions from the internet, so have a go.
Yes, we have a question from the internet about the referring to the privacy bill that the CRS has drafted. So someone's asking, does the bill communicate information that could be understood by the general public, not necessarily educated, if it were debated in Parliament?
Sorry, can you repeat the last part? So if the bill was debated in Parliament, would that what? I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question.
Okay. So, does the privacy bill that CRS has drafted communicate information that could be understood by the common man if it were debated in Parliament? So, common man not necessarily having been educated.
Hopefully, yes. Hopefully. So essentially what this bill, I haven't personally drafted this bill. It's been drafted by my lawyer colleague. Essentially what this bill does is that it regulates data protection. So data protection covers all data collected and stored through the interception of communications or whatever. This involves basically that data might be collected through companies, data which may be collected through schemes, and literally all types of data. So it regulates it. And then on top of that, what it does is it regulates surveillance. So by regulating surveillance and by regulating data protection, essentially that way it kind of tries to protect data which is harvested by the government, even data collected by citizens who are the least affected by it or not. So for example, like I mentioned before, the UID scheme mainly affects the poor in India because they're the ones who are the most likely to register because they're the ones who have to get access to BPL cash programs, right? So by doing so, their data is vulnerable. But through this bill, what we aim to do is protect this type of data that's collected to ensure that in every case, it's very clear legally who has access to the data, under what conditions this data is disclosed, and if so, why and how, and so on, who it is shared with, how long it's retained for, and all other questions revolving around it. So this bill is not very specific to specific types of data, but it covers data protection in general, and it regulates surveillance and the interception of communications in general, and it also establishes a privacy commission, which is responsible for ensuring that data actually is protected. But yeah, sure, this bill obviously isn't perfect. I'm sure you can find lots of space for criticism, and I'm sure there might be loopholes. It's very hard to create a perfect bill, especially because the approach we have is that we've been discussing this bill in roundtable meetings with multi-stakeholders. So we've actually had a lot of people from the industry attending these talks. And they've really tried to influence our bill in the sense that what they've been arguing is that, hey, if individuals choose to give up their data to our services, that obviously means that they trust us with their data. So that way, we're obviously getting their consent, so we don't have to ask for their consent in either way. We're trying to say, no, that should not be the case. You should always gain individual consent prior to handling their data in any way. But it's difficult, because the thing is, in order to actually implement the bill, we have to discuss it with a lot of stakeholders from the industry, from the government, and so on, because we need them to support the bill so that it can be implemented at all, ever. But at the same time, they are trying to influence it in a way which is not very privacy friendly. We're getting there, we're still discussing the bill, and if you like, I can email it to you and you can have a look. I'm not sure if that covered your question, though.
Okay, I think we're out of time right now, so if you still have any questions, I see you standing there and over there. I think you will be able to answer them off stage.
Yeah, of course. If you have any other questions, come find me. I'm happy to answer and to discuss and analyze anything you like.
Great, thank you very much.